On a November night in 1858, in a stone chapel on the grounds of Rosewood Hall outside Natchez, Mississippi, a Confederate colonel locked his pregnant daughter inside with 4 enslaved men and walked away. The wager that led to that moment involved $47,000 in gambling debts, a secret society of plantation owners who bet on human suffering, and a rivalry between 2 of the most powerful men in Adams County. By dawn, the daughter would be found alive but unable to speak. The 4 men would have vanished without a trace, and a sealed letter discovered in the chapel would reveal secrets that destroyed 2 of Mississippi's most prominent families. What happened in those dark hours remained hidden for decades, protected by lies, by money, by the same power structures that had made the wager possible in the first place. But the truth has a way of emerging, even when buried under generations of silence. Before we continue with the story of Colonel Augustus Fairmont and the night that shattered his family forever, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now, and in the comments below, tell me what state or city you're listening from. This story connects to events that happened across the antebellum South, dark conspiracies that powerful men thought they'd hidden forever. I want to know where you are as we uncover what they tried to bury. The truth about that night emerged slowly, in fragments, through testimony given in hushed voices and documents discovered in places no one thought to look. Natchez in 1858 stood as a monument to cotton wealth, where fortunes rose and fell with the Liverpool Exchange, and where the families in white-columned mansions along the bluffs had perfected the art of appearing respectable while engaging in unspeakable cruelty. Colonel Augustus Fairmont had built Rosewood Hall 16 years earlier with his first wife's Virginia tobacco fortune. 12 acres of grounds, 200 people held in bondage, cotton fields stretching to the horizon. At 53, silver-haired and perpetually bourbon-soaked, Fairmont presided over Natchez society with his second wife Constance, a New Orleans woman who'd married him for security and learned too late what maintaining that security would require. Elizabeth, Fairmont's daughter from his first marriage, was 24 that autumn, 5 months pregnant, married to Captain Richard Bowling, who'd left for Kansas Territory 6 months after their hasty wedding. Those who knew the family whispered that the marriage had been arranged to settle gambling debts, that young Bowling had fled at the first opportunity, that Elizabeth understood perfectly what she was to her father, collateral to be traded when circumstances demanded. She kept a journal hidden beneath her bedroom floorboards, its pages revealing a woman who'd been watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when she'd need to act to save herself. The 4 men who would become central to this nightmare lived in the quarters behind the main house. Samuel, 42, worked as head carpenter, his skilled hands building wealth he'd never own. Joshua, 35, manned the forge as blacksmith, still grieving the son sold away 2 years prior. Marcus, 38, managed the stables with quiet competence, making himself invisible to white eyes whenever possible. And Isaac, 47, served as driver and unofficial preacher, his deep voice leading Sunday worship in the clearing the enslaved were permitted for prayer. These 4 men were respected in their community for settling disputes, protecting the vulnerable, teaching reading in secret despite laws forbidding it. They were also the men Fairmont pointed to when demonstrating his humane management. Proof, he claimed, that slavery could be benevolent. What Fairmont never realized was how much they hated him, because he'd never bothered to look beyond his own assumptions. The wager itself grew from a secret society called the Magnolia Club, 8 plantation owners who met twice monthly in a back room at the Natchez Hotel to bet on everything from steamboat races to human endurance. They kept a leather-bound ledger documenting every wager, each entry witnessed and verified. For years they'd been betting on human stakes. Which enslaved woman would bear a child first? Which man could pick the most cotton? Which family could be separated without anyone attempting suicide? It was sport to them, a way to assert dominance while maintaining their facade as gentlemen. Augustus Fairmont had been losing steadily for 3 years. By October 1858, he owed Judge Cornelius Draper $47,000, enough to require selling Rosewood itself. Draper, who'd nursed a grudge against Fairmont since 1851, when Fairmont's testimony had cost him a valuable land deal, saw his opportunity for perfect revenge. On October 29th, in that smoke-filled back room thick with cigar smoke and bourbon, he proposed a wager that made even hardened plantation owners shift uncomfortably. "Your daughter Elizabeth," Draper said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years on the bench. 5 months pregnant, husband conveniently absent. "I'll forgive your entire debt if you deliver her to your chapel on November 14th for one night with 4 of your most trusted men, Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac. If she emerges intact and the men fulfill their duty, you're clear. If they refuse, if anyone escapes, if anything goes wrong, you owe me double plus Rosewood as collateral." The room went silent, except for the clock's relentless ticking. William Keene, who owned the largest cotton gin in the county, leaned forward with interest. "It tests everything. Control, nerve, obedience. Using his own blood makes it perfect." Fairmont's hands trembled on his glass. His mind raced through alternatives. Bankruptcy would destroy the family name. Fleeing would make him a laughingstock. Refusing would mean immediate ruin. In his twisted arithmetic, Elizabeth had already been reduced to property, married off to settle one debt, now useful for settling another. "I accept," he whispered, and signed his name beneath the terms. The trap was set. 14 days to prepare. And none of them, not Fairmont, not Draper, not the witnesses, understood that the trap would spring in a direction they never anticipated. Elizabeth learned of the wager on November 12th, when her personal maid Clara, a woman who'd raised her from infancy, slipped into a room after midnight and whispered the terrible truth. Clara had overheard Constance discussing arrangements, had seen the 4 families being moved to a locked storage building, had watched the chapel being prepared with heavy curtains and exterior locks. "Miss Elizabeth, you must run," Clara urged. "Take a horse tonight and ride north. There are people who help." 5 months pregnant, alone on winter roads. Elizabeth's voice was steady despite her shaking hands. "I'd die, Clara, the baby and I both." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark grounds. "They think I'm a pawn. Father has wagered me before. My marriage was payment for his debts. But I'm not without resources. If they're determined to play this game, then I'll play too. By my own rules." The next morning, Elizabeth confronted Constance in the garden, her voice quiet and cold. "I know about the wager. I know about November 14th. And you have 2 choices. Let this proceed as planned, and I will spend every remaining day of my life destroying Father's name and your position. I'll tell Richard's family. I'll testify in any court. I'll make sure everyone knows what happened. Or you can help me turn this into something Father and Draper never anticipated, and I'll keep your secrets forever." What Elizabeth proposed was audacious, a conspiracy within the conspiracy, using Draper's own terms against him. It required cooperation from 4 men who had no reason to trust any white person, perfect timing, flawless performance, and one additional element. A sealed letter Elizabeth had been carrying for months, waiting for exactly the right moment to use it. Constance, calculating survival odds with the cold precision she'd learned growing up poor in New Orleans, agreed. They had 36 hours. The 4 men learned their duty on November 11th, when Overseer Silas Garrett summoned them to his office. He laid a pistol on the desk and spoke without preamble. "November 14th, 9 o'clock at night, you report to the chapel. Miss Elizabeth will be there. You'll spend the night with her. You understand what that means?" The silence was absolute. 4 men who'd survived decades of bondage suddenly faced an order that shattered even the brutal logic they'd learned to navigate. "Sir," Joshua said carefully, "Miss Elizabeth is the master's daughter, a married woman, carrying a child. This cannot be—" "It's an order," Garrett cut him off. "Your families are secured in the storage building. Refuse this, and by dawn, they'll be sold south." separately, different buyers, you'll never see them again. Obey, stay silent, and afterward you'll have better rations, lighter work, maybe even freedom papers eventually. Choose. What choice existed? They agreed because the alternative meant watching their children vanish. As they left, Isaac murmured the prayer that had sustained generations. Lord, give us strength to endure what we cannot change. But on November 13th, something impossible happened. Elizabeth and Clara slipped into the locked building where the four families waited in terrified confusion. Standing among frightened women and children, feeling her own baby move inside her, Elizabeth said, "What's about to happen to me is also happening to you. We're all pieces in a game men are playing. But I have a plan to stop them. I need you to trust me." She explained her plan. When she finished, Samuel's wife, Rachel, studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll convince Samuel. The others will follow." That afternoon, in a hurried meeting in the emptied storage building, Elizabeth told the four men what she proposed. It was dangerous, required split-second timing, and depended on everyone playing their part perfectly. But it offered something they'd been denied their entire lives: agency. "Why should we trust you?" Joshua asked bluntly. "You shouldn't," Elizabeth said. "But if tonight proceeds as planned, I'm destroyed and you're destroyed. If my plan works, we all survive with something we didn't have before. Documented proof of what happened. Protection against future threats. Leverage. I can't promise freedom, but I can promise that if we survive this night, I'll do everything in my power to ensure you're never used as leverage again." The four men exchanged glances, decades of survival instinct weighing impossible odds. "We'll do it," Samuel said finally. "God help us all." The remaining hours passed in feverish preparation. Clara retrieved specific items from Elizabeth's room: the sealed letter, Elizabeth's journal, a small knife. Constance managed the household to prevent unexpected interruptions. The men memorized their roles, practiced timing to the minute. As sunset approached on November 14th, Judge Draper arrived with witnesses, Keene and a planter named Sutherland, who would verify compliance with the wager's terms. They were shown to a drawing room, served whiskey and cigars, treating the night's events as entertainment rather than atrocity. At 9 o'clock exactly, Elizabeth walked the path to the chapel, her father beside her, silent and bourbon-reeking. Behind them came Constance, Draper, and the witnesses. The chapel glowed with candlelight, almost beautiful in the November darkness. Inside, the four men waited, standing in a space they'd been forbidden to enter in daylight, now commanded to occupy for the darkest purpose imaginable. Fairmont unlocked the door and pushed it open. Elizabeth stepped across the threshold and turned to look at her father one last time. "May God forgive you," she said quietly, "because I never will." The door closed. The lock clicked, and 5 people stood in candlelight, facing the longest night of their lives. Elizabeth spoke first, her voice steady. "They're listening at the door. We need to give them what they expect to hear initially. Sounds convincing enough to satisfy them. Then we execute the plan exactly as discussed." For the first hour, they performed carefully. Elizabeth cried out at timed intervals, sounds of distress that could be interpreted as expected. The men moved furniture, creating noise, suggesting activity. Through the stained glass window, shadows occasionally passed, witnesses checking that events were proceeding according to the wager. But what actually happened inside that chapel was entirely different. Elizabeth sat on the fainting couch and told the four men everything. The complete truth about the wager, her father's debts, the Magnolia Club's ledger of human stakes, Constance's complicity. She explained about the lies being constructed to protect the Fairmont name regardless of what happened that night. "The wager states I must be intact in the morning," Elizabeth said. "They expect violation, proof you followed orders. But the terms specify only the outcome, not what happens during the night. And there's something they don't know, something that changes everything. She pulled out the sealed letter she'd carried for months. This letter contains 2 confessions. The first concerns the child I'm carrying, and it's not my husband's child. The second is about a crime my father committed 15 years ago to hide his own mixed ancestry. Judge Draper has spent years obsessed with bloodlines, trying to prove white purity. This letter will destroy both families, but it will also ensure that if anything happens to any of us, if we're harmed, sold, silenced, this information reaches every newspaper and courthouse in Mississippi. They'll be ruined. Samuel leaned forward intently. What are you saying? I'm saying we're creating mutually assured destruction. By morning, we'll have proof of tonight documented in multiple ways. We'll hide this letter where only we know to find it. If Draper or my father ever threaten you or your families again, the truth goes public. They'll be destroyed. Marcus asked quietly. And what happens to you when dawn comes? Elizabeth's hand rested on her swollen belly. I'm going to play the role they expect. Traumatized, silent, broken. I'll let them believe the night destroyed me, but inside I'll know the truth, and I'll be working to get you to safety. I have contacts in the north, people my real mother knew who work with the Underground Railroad. It will take time, but I will get you out. The hours passed in whispered conversation. They talked about their lives, families, dreams deferred and denied. Elizabeth learned that Samuel could read and write, that he'd been teaching others secretly for years. Joshua spoke of his sold son and nightly prayers to see him again. Marcus described the horses he'd trained, how he could gentle any creature if given patience and time. Isaac recited scripture from memory, his voice carrying weight of faith maintained against all evidence. Around 3 a.m, footsteps approached. Elizabeth quickly arranged herself to appear disheveled, the men positioned around the room. Through the keyhole, someone watched and listened. Then the footsteps retreated. They're satisfied, Elizabeth whispered. They believe we're doing what they expect. As dawn approached, they finalized details. The letter would be hidden in a loose stone behind the altar. Elizabeth would emerge unable to speak, muteness that would excuse her from testimony and questions. The 4 men would disappear that night using routes Isaac knew from years of driving between plantations. What about our families? Samuel asked. Rachel and the others know the plan. At dawn, they'll create enough chaos that in the confusion, you can slip away. It's dangerous, but staying is more dangerous. At first light, Elizabeth took the small knife and made 3 shallow cuts on her arm, enough to bleed, to leave marks suggesting struggle. She tore her nightgown slightly, mussed her hair further. When they open that door, she said, I collapse. I don't speak. No matter what they ask or threaten, the ambiguity protects all of us. The men arranged the room to suggest brutality. Overturned furniture, burned down candles, Elizabeth's blood on the couch. They positioned themselves near the door, ready. At exactly 6 o'clock, the lock turned. Judge Draper entered, followed by Keene and Sutherland. Augustus Fairmont stood behind them, face gray, hands shaking. Elizabeth lay on the couch, eyes open but unfocused, blood visible on her arm, body trembling. When Draper spoke her name, she didn't respond. When he demanded she tell them what happened, she stared through him as if he weren't there. Miss Elizabeth, Draper said sharply, you need to speak. Nothing. Not a word, not a sound. Constance pushed past the men and knelt beside the couch, her performance flawless. Elizabeth, darling, speak to me, please. Still nothing. Draper turned to the 4 men. You fulfilled your duty? Samuel met his eyes steadily. We did what we were told, sir. Exactly what we were told. Perfect. Confirmation without detail, obedience without admission. Draper studied them, then turned back to Elizabeth, still silent and trembling. He looked dissatisfied but couldn't dispute the terms had been met. The wager is settled. Your debt is cleared, Augustus. Fairmont didn't respond, just stared at his daughter with an expression that might have been guilt or calculation, impossible to distinguish. As they carried Elizabeth back to the house, as a doctor was summoned, as Constance began managing the crisis, the four men were escorted to their quarters. They knew, and their wives knew, they had only hours before someone decided eliminating witnesses was safer than letting them live. What happened in the immediate aftermath would be disputed for years. The official story claimed the four men escaped that night, stealing horses and vanishing north. But there were other accounts, whispered in quarters and testified to in depositions, that would surface much later. Some said the men were hunted and killed within days, their bodies hidden in the river. Others claimed they made it to freedom but could never return for their families. The truth, as it emerged over decades, was more complicated than either version. Elizabeth never spoke another word. Medical doctors examined her and found no physical cause for her muteness. Some called it hysteria, others shock. Still others whispered about divine punishment for sins unnamed. She gave birth to twins in April 1859, a boy and a girl, both healthy, both bearing identical marks on their left shoulders that looked like deliberate scars, but might have been birthmarks. Captain Richard Bowling returned from Kansas Territory in 1860, learned Constance's carefully edited version of events, and promptly divorced Elizabeth on grounds of mental incapacity. She and her children were moved to a small cottage on Rosewood's edge, effectively exiled but still dependent on Fairmont's increasingly strained finances. Augustus Fairmont volunteered for Confederate service in 1861, despite being 56, an age when most men stayed home. Those who knew him said he sought either redemption or death, and didn't care which found him first. He was killed at Shiloh in April 1862, shot through the chest during a tactically pointless charge. His last words, according to the private who held him, were, "Tell Elizabeth I'm sorry." The message was never delivered. Constance survived the war by selling off Rosewood piece by piece, by entertaining Union officers at dinner parties where she pretended to have always sympathized with the North, by doing whatever was necessary to maintain position. The war freed the enslaved people who hadn't already fled, scattering them across Mississippi and beyond. Among them were the four wives and their children, Rachel, Samuel's wife, and the others, who disappeared into the chaos of Reconstruction. Whether they ever reunited with their husbands remained unknown to Natchez society. Judge Cornelius Draper served as Confederate military judge until 1864, when his plantation was burned by formerly enslaved men who joined Union forces. Draper survived but was left with burns across half his face. He became a recluse, living in his damaged mansion, emerging only for necessary business, his scarred face hidden behind a black silk mask. His obsession with genealogical research intensified to the point of mania, spending days in courthouses tracing bloodlines with feverish precision, searching for something he never quite found. The other Magnolia Club members fared no better. Keene lost 2 sons at Vicksburg and his cotton gin to a mysterious fire in 1865. He drank himself to death by 1867. Sutherland was found in the Mississippi River in 1866, his body weighted with chains in what was ruled suicide but looked like murder. 3 other members died before 1870. Yellow fever, a fall from a horse, complications from what doctors called nervous exhaustion. By 1870, only Draper remained alive from the group that had witnessed Fairmont's signature in the ledger, and the ledger itself had vanished. Some said Constance destroyed it. Others claimed it was stolen during Union occupation. Rumors persisted that it had been taken by someone who planned to use it as evidence if the right moment came. Elizabeth's twins, Sarah and Thomas, grew up in that cottage, hearing their mother's pen scratch across paper every night, seeing her lips move as if speaking words only she could hear. They learned that their mother's silence wasn't absence but presence, constant testimony to something so terrible it could only be witnessed, not spoken. Just when we thought the story ended with silence and scattered survivors, something extraordinary happened in 1871 that would change everything. If this story is gripping you, if you want to know what happened next, hit that like button right now and share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happened next proves that sometimes justice takes decades but never dies completely. Let's discover together what emerged from 13 years of silence. In spring of 1871, when Sarah was 12 and Thomas 11, a man appeared at their cottage door. He was black, in his 50s, well-dressed, carrying papers identifying him as a freedman named Samuel Garrison. He asked to speak with Elizabeth, and when she appeared, he said simply, "Miss Elizabeth, I've come to tell you we kept our promise too." Elizabeth, who hadn't reacted visibly to another human being in 13 years, embraced him and wept. Over the following week, Samuel told the twins what their mother couldn't speak. He told them about the wager, the night in the chapel, the conspiracy that had saved all their lives. He told them all 4 men had made it north, that they'd worked for years to earn money to return, that they'd spent the last decade searching for the families they'd been forced to leave behind. "Your mother saved our lives," Samuel said. "We spent 13 years making sure we could honor that debt. We couldn't come back during the war, too dangerous. But now, with Reconstruction, we can finally do what we promised." He showed them documents, papers proving he and the others had purchased land in Ohio, had established a community for formerly enslaved people, had created networks helping refugees from the South. He told them Joshua had found his souled son, that Marcus had started a horse training business, that Isaac had become a minister to a mixed congregation. "We never forgot what happened in that chapel," Samuel said. "We never forgot that your mother chose to trust us when she had no reason to. If you ever need help, if you ever need a place to go, you have family waiting in Ohio." Elizabeth listened with tears streaming down her face, then picked up pen and paper and wrote, "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for remembering." Samuel stayed a month, helping repair the cottage, teaching Thomas carpentry, bringing news from beyond Mississippi. Before leaving, he gave Elizabeth a small locked box. "Inside, this is everything we documented from that night. The letter you wrote, copies of testimony we gave to a northern lawyer, affidavits from people who knew what happened. We kept it safe because we knew someday it might be needed. If anyone ever threatens you or your children, you have proof." After Samuel returned to Ohio, Elizabeth began teaching, both black and white children, though mostly black, in her cottage. She used the connections Samuel provided to help formerly enslaved people navigate Reconstruction's complicated bureaucracy. Constance, watching from the main house, was torn between horror and admiration at what her stepdaughter had become. In 1873, Elizabeth did something unexpected. She took her children to a lawyer, a northern transplant named Harrison Fletcher, who specialized in Reconstruction cases. In writing, she said she wanted to file charges against Judge Draper and her father's estate for conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted assault. Fletcher was stunned. "Mrs. Bowling, these charges will be nearly impossible to prosecute. Judge Draper has considerable influence. Your father's estate is politically connected through your stepmother. Most witnesses are dead. And you forgive me, but without verbal testimony." Elizabeth handed him the locked box. Inside were Samuel's documents, the letter she'd hidden and later retrieved, testimony from the 4 men given to Northern authorities, and her own journals. 13 years of written testimony describing not just that night, but the entire system that had made it possible. Fletcher read through the materials with growing astonishment. "This is explosive. If even half this is introduced into evidence, it destroys several prominent families. But you understand the risks? Social consequences, potential retaliation." Elizabeth wrote, "I've been silent 13 years. That silence protected my children and gave the 4 men time to establish safety. But silence has also protected the guilty. It's time for truth to be spoken, even if I must speak it in writing." The case that followed, Bowling versus Draper, filed in federal court in 1873, never reached trial, but its filing documents became public record and contained enough detail about the Magnolia Club to scandalize even a community hardened to slavery's brutalities. Newspapers from Jackson to New Orleans picked up the story, and suddenly respectable Natchez families found their names associated with practices that even many Confederate sympathizers found appalling. Judge Draper, now 73 and still hiding behind his silk mask, hired lawyers to suppress the case. They argued the wager occurred when such property relations were legal under Mississippi law, that statutes of limitations had expired on criminal charges, that Elizabeth's muteness made her unreliable. More quietly, they suggested her written testimony might have been fabricated by radical Reconstructionists seeking to defame respected Southern families. But the documents Samuel had preserved told a corroborated story. Testimony from living witnesses, physical evidence, a chain of documentation difficult to dismiss. The case dragged on 18 months through motions, counter-motions, intimidation attempts, and settlement offers. Constance, desperate to protect what remained of the Fairmont name, begged Elizabeth to drop the charges. "You're destroying the family," she wrote. "Sarah and Thomas will never be accepted in society. Is your revenge worth their futures?" Elizabeth's written response was brief. "I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking justice. My children will inherit truth, which is worth more than acceptance into a society built on lies." The case was settled out of court in 1875. Terms were sealed, but those who knew the families noticed changes. Judge Draper transferred substantial property to a trust funding schools for freedmen's children. The Fairmont estate was liquidated, proceeds divided between Constance, Elizabeth, and a fund compensating families subjected to the Magnolia Club's wages. It wasn't enough, couldn't be enough. Money couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't restore broken families or lost years. But it was acknowledgement, documented and witnessed, that what happened in that chapel was a crime, not a right. The settlement included one unusual provision. All documents related to the case, including Elizabeth's journals, Samuel's testimony, and the letter from the chapel, were to be sealed for 100 years, until 1975. The reason given was protection of living descendants, but the truth was more complex. The letter Elizabeth had hidden in the chapel contained 2 confessions that would have destroyed multiple prominent families. The first concerned the true paternity of her twins. The second revealed evidence that Augustus Fairmont's grandmother had been a woman of mixed race, passed off as white through falsified documents. In the 1850s South, where laws defined anyone with African blood as black and therefore subject to enslavement, this revelation was equivalent to social dynamite. If Fairmont had Negro blood, then by the South's own logic, he shouldn't have owned property, including people, at all. His marriages would have been illegal, his children illegitimate. Judge Draper had discovered hints of this truth in his genealogical research. That's why he'd proposed the wager. He wanted to prove Fairmont's bloodline was tainted to create a situation where the truth would emerge. But Elizabeth had outmaneuvered them both. Her letter revealed she'd known about her father's ancestry for years. Her real mother had told her on her deathbed. Elizabeth had been carrying this knowledge like a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment. The letter also revealed the second truth. The children Elizabeth carried weren't her husband's. They resulted from assault by Dr. Marcus Henley, a Natchez physician who was Draper's cousin and a Magnolia Club member. Henley had attended Elizabeth during an illness in early 1858. She'd kept silent because reporting would have ruined her. As a woman, she'd have been blamed. But in the letter, she documented everything: dates, details, witnesses. This revelation transformed the entire wager. Draper had inadvertently set up exposure of his own cousin's crime. If the twins showed features that proved Fairmont's mixed ancestry, Elizabeth could reveal those features came from Henley's assault, not from anything in the chapel or Fairmont's bloodline. Draper would be forced to either admit his cousin was a rapist or admit his genealogical theories were wrong. It was a perfect trap, built while everyone underestimated her. The sealed documents also contained Constance's statement, added in 1876. In it, she confessed her role in the wages planning, her betrayal of her stepdaughter, her reasons for ultimately helping Elizabeth's counterplan. "I participated in evil," Constance wrote, "because I believed my survival depended on it. I helped Elizabeth in the end not from suddenly developed conscience, but because she showed me my survival actually depended on her plan succeeding. I am not redeemed by one good choice after a dozen bad ones. I am simply a woman who learned too late that the system I benefited from would eventually devour me too." Constance died in 1881, having lived her final years in a small Natchez house, supported by settlement income. She was buried in the Fairmont family plot, though local society largely shunned her funeral. Fewer than a dozen mourners attended, most of them formerly enslaved people she'd employed in her last years. Judge Draper died in 1877, 2 years after the settlement, his final months consumed by morphine addiction. His last words, according to his attending doctor, were, "The ledger. Destroy the ledger." But the Magnolia Club's ledger was never found. In the years following the settlement, strange events began occurring that suggested the Magnolia Club's legacy wasn't finished. In 1878, William Keene's son, who'd inherited what remained of the family property, was found dead in his study, an apparent suicide. He'd left a note saying only, "The sins of the fathers." The same year, Sutherland's nephew died in a hunting accident that witnesses said looked more like murder than mishap. By 1880, 7 men connected to the original Magnolia Club members had died under suspicious circumstances. Some were ruled accidents, some suicides, one murder by unknown assailant. Natchez society whispered about a curse, about divine retribution, about the wages of sin visited upon children and grandchildren. The truth was simpler and more human. In 1882, a deathbed confession from a man named Abraham, who'd been enslaved by Judge Draper and freed during the war, revealed that he'd been systematically tracking down and killing members of the Magnolia Club and their descendants. He'd kept the club's ledger, stolen from Draper's study during the war, and had spent 15 years using it to identify everyone involved in the human wagers, then making them pay. "I killed 11 men," Abraham confessed to the minister attending him. 11 men who either participated in those wagers or who inherited fortunes built on them and refused to make amends. "I'm not sorry. I'd do it again. Let God judge me as he will, but I couldn't let them live in peace while my people's suffering was forgotten." The confession was suppressed. Local authorities didn't want to admit that a freedman had been murdering prominent white men for years without detection. Abraham died the next day, was buried in an unmarked grave, and his confession was filed away in courthouse records where it remained hidden for decades. The ledger Abraham had kept disappeared with him. Some said he'd hidden it, others that he'd destroyed it before dying. But rumors persisted that it existed somewhere, that it documented not just the Fairmont Draper wager, but 237 other human stakes made between 1847 and 1865, implicating 53 prominent Southern families. Elizabeth lived until 1899, dying at 65. She never spoke another word aloud, but her written words filled hundreds of journals. Her school grew, eventually merging with other Reconstruction-era schools to become part of the foundation for black education in Mississippi. Sarah and Thomas both became teachers, carrying forward their mother's work. In 1897, 2 years before Elizabeth's death, Isaac appeared at her home, the preacher from that night, now 76 and walking with a cane. He'd traveled from Ohio to see Elizabeth one last time, to tell her all 4 men had lived to see their children educated, their grandchildren born free, their communities established. "We never forgot you," Isaac said, sitting in Elizabeth's parlor while Sarah served tea. "We never forgot what you did, what you risked. We've told the story to our children and grandchildren, passed it down so they'll know that in the darkest moment, a white woman chose to be human. That's worth remembering." Elizabeth wrote her response. "I didn't save you. We saved each other." That's what should be remembered. Not that one person was heroic, but that in impossible circumstances, people on different sides of an evil system chose to see each other's humanity. That's the only way anything changes. When Elizabeth died in 1899, she was buried next to her mother in a recently integrated cemetery. Her headstone bore a simple inscription: Elizabeth Fairmont Bowling, 1834-1899. She spoke truth in silence. The sealed documents remained locked in Adams County Courthouse until 1920, when they were transferred to the newly established Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The 100-year seal meant they wouldn't be opened until 1975, but even sealed, they exerted influence. Historians knew something important was hidden there, and the mystery of what the documents contained became part of Mississippi's historical mythology. In 1923, when the archives acquired Elizabeth's journals from Sarah's estate sale, a graduate student named Robert Chen spent 3 years cataloging them. His dissertation, Silence and Testimony, Resistance in Reconstruction Mississippi, drew on Elizabeth's writings to challenge prevailing narratives about Southern women's passivity during and after the Civil War. Chen's work was largely ignored when published in 1929, dismissed as too radical and focused on exceptional cases rather than representative patterns. But Chen had discovered something in the journals that he didn't include in his published work, something that made him write a sealed letter to the archives director, marked not to be opened until 1975, when the original documents would be unsealed. In that letter, Chen explained that Elizabeth's journals contained coded passages, references to the Second Testament, and the carpenter's gift that suggested additional documents existed somewhere, hidden by Samuel before he returned to Ohio in 1871. Chen had spent months trying to decipher the codes and locate these additional documents. He'd traveled to Ohio, interviewed Samuel's descendants, searched property records and old houses. He'd found nothing concrete, but he'd become convinced that Samuel had created a backup archive, a complete duplicate of everything in the sealed courthouse documents, plus additional testimony hidden somewhere in Natchez itself, as insurance against the sealed documents being destroyed or lost. I believe, Chen wrote in his sealed letter, that Samuel Garrison was too careful, too thorough, to trust that one sealed box in one courthouse would survive 100 years. He knew that powerful people would want those documents destroyed. So he created insurance, a second archive, hidden in a location that would be revealed only when the first archive was opened. Elizabeth's journals contain clues to this location, but I could not solve them in the time I had. Perhaps future researchers, with the full documents available in 1975, will succeed where I failed. Chen died in 1945, having spent his final years teaching at a small Negro college in Georgia, his dissertation long forgotten by mainstream historians. His sealed letter remained in the archives, unknown to anyone except the director who'd received it and who died himself in 1938 without telling anyone about it. Meanwhile, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, something strange began happening to the descendants of the Magnolia Club families. A series of anonymous letters appeared, each containing a single page, photocopied from what appeared to be the missing ledger. Each letter was addressed to a specific descendant and contained an entry describing a wager their ancestor had participated in, complete with names, dates, amounts, and outcomes described in cold, precise language. The letters included no demands, no threats, just the documentation itself and a single typed line at the bottom. The truth is patient. It can wait. Nobody knew who was sending the letters. Some recipients burned them immediately, terrified of what they revealed. Others kept them hidden, afraid to destroy them, but equally afraid to acknowledge them. A few, a very few, tried to investigate, hiring private detectives to trace the letters' origin. Every investigation led nowhere. The letters stopped in 1935 as mysteriously as they'd begun. By then, pages from the ledger had reached 47 different people across 7 states. Some of these people were prominent: a Mississippi congressman, a Louisiana judge, a wealthy Alabama planter. Others were ordinary citizens living quiet lives, unaware until the letters arrived that their family fortunes had been built on documented human wages. The letters had an effect that their sender, whoever it was, likely intended. Some families quietly began making amends, donating to Negro colleges, funding scholarships, supporting civil rights organizations. Others doubled down on denial, burning family papers, suppressing documents, threatening anyone who asked too many questions about their ancestors. In 1938, a historian named Margaret Crawford attempted to write a comprehensive history of the Magnolia Club based on the letter fragments and other sources. She'd interviewed dozens of people, compiled copies of the ledger pages that recipients were willing to share, cross-referenced them with other historical documents. Her manuscript, titled Wagers in Human Flesh, The Magnolia Club, and Systematic Cruelty in Antebellum Mississippi, was completed in 1940. No publisher would touch it. Crawford sent the manuscript to 23 different presses over the course of 4 years. All rejected it, most without explanation. 2 editors wrote back saying frankly that the material was too inflammatory, that publishing it would invite lawsuits from powerful families, that the scholarly community wasn't ready for this kind of historical reckoning. Frustrated and dying of tuberculosis, Crawford donated her entire research archive, including the manuscript and all her collected ledger pages, to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in 1944, with the stipulation that it be sealed until 1975, to be opened at the same time as the original Bowling versus Draper documents. Perhaps, Crawford wrote in her cover letter, in 1975, 30 years after this war ends, America will be ready to face the truth about what we were and what we did. Perhaps by then, enough time will have passed that we can look at this history without flinching, without making excuses, without trying to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Systematic, documented, witnessed cruelty, treated as entertainment by men who considered themselves gentlemen. Crawford died in 1945, her work unpublished, her name forgotten, but her archive joined the growing collection of sealed documents waiting for 1975, adding yet another layer to the mystery of what would be revealed when the seals were finally broken. By the late 1940s, the sealed documents had taken on an almost mythical quality in Mississippi historical circles. Everyone knew something important was hidden there. Rumors circulated about what the documents might contain. Some said evidence of murders, others claimed proof of widespread corruption. Still others whispered about scandals that would destroy half the old families in the state. The truth, waiting patiently in those sealed boxes, was both simpler and more profound than the rumors suggested. It wasn't about individual scandals or spectacular crimes. It was about a system, documented, witnessed, recorded by its perpetrators, and about the people who'd resisted it, survived it, testified against it, despite impossible odds. In 1947, an elderly black woman named Grace Henderson walked into the Mississippi Archives and asked to speak with the director. She identified herself as the granddaughter of Marcus, the stable manager from Rosewood Hall. She carried a small wooden box, worn smooth by decades of handling. "My grandfather gave this to my mother before he died in 1903, Grace explained. "She gave it to me in 1920 with instructions to bring it here in 1947, exactly 90 years after the events it describes. Inside are his personal papers, his testimony about the night of November 14, 1858, letters from the other 3 men, and documents about what happened to them after they reached Ohio. My grandfather wanted this to be added to the sealed archive to ensure that when 1975 comes, the complete truth is available." The director accepted the box and added it to the sealed collection. Grace asked only one question before leaving. Will people understand, when they finally read all of this, what it cost? Will they understand that survival itself was resistance, that keeping these testimonies alive for 100 years was its own kind of victory? The director had no answer. Grace nodded as if she'd expected that and left. She died 2 years later, having fulfilled the obligation her grandfather had passed down through 2 generations. Between 1947 and 1950, 3 more descendants came forward with materials to add to the sealed archive. Joshua's great-grandson brought letters describing the search for his souled son and their eventual reunion in Ohio. Isaac's granddaughter contributed a copy of sermons Isaac had preached, comparing the chapel conspiracy to biblical stories of resistance and survival. And Sarah Bowling's daughter, Elizabeth's granddaughter, donated the last of Elizabeth's journals, ones even more detailed than those already in the archives, describing not just the night in the chapel, but the years of preparation leading up to it and the decades of work that followed. Each edition made the sealed archive more complete, more powerful, more dangerous to those who still wanted the past buried, and each edition increased the anticipation for 1975, when everything would finally be revealed. But something else was happening in those post-war years that would change how the documents would eventually be received. The civil rights movement was gaining strength, challenging the same power structures that had protected the Magnolia Club members a century earlier. Young people, black and white, were beginning to ask harder questions about Southern history, refusing to accept the comfortable myths about benevolent slavery and lost cause nobility. The sealed documents, waiting patiently in their boxes, were about to become relevant in ways their creators couldn't have anticipated. They weren't just historical curiosities. They were evidence, proof that the cruelties of slavery had been systematic, documented, witnessed, and protected by respectable society. Proof that resistance had always existed. Proof that truth, no matter how long suppressed, eventually finds its way into the light. Just when we thought this story would have to wait until 1975 to conclude, something happened in 1949 that brought it roaring back into the present and revealed secrets that no one anticipated. If you're still with me, if this story has its hooks in you, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happened next proves that some conspiracies take a century to fully unfold. Let's discover the final truth together. In August 1949, Rosewood Hall, abandoned since Constance's death in 1881, slowly collapsing under kudzu and weather, finally gave way. The main structure's roof caved in during a summer storm, and the Natchez City Council, concerned about liability and historical preservation, authorized a survey of the ruins before deciding whether to demolish or stabilize what remained. The survey team, led by an architect named Thomas Whitfield and including a young historian named Dorothy Keene, spent 3 weeks documenting the property. On the final day, while photographing the chapel ruins, the stone walls still standing though the roof had long since collapsed, Keene noticed something odd about the altar platform. The stones didn't quite fit together properly, and there appeared to be a hollow space beneath. Whitfield brought in equipment to carefully lift the altar stone. Beneath it, in a sealed iron box wrapped in oilcloth, they found a leather-bound book and a collection of papers that had been protected from moisture and decay for 91 years. The leather-bound book was the Magnolia Club's complete ledger, all 237 wagers documented in meticulous detail from 1847 to 1865. 53 plantation owners' names appeared in its pages, describing wagers that ranged from cruel to incomprehensibly monstrous. The entries were written in different hands, suggesting each member had recorded their own wagers, witnessed by others. The clinical language made it worse somehow. Human suffering described with the same precision used for recording crop yields or livestock sales. The papers with it included Samuel's personal testimony, written in 1871 before he returned to Ohio, describing not just the night in the chapel, but what he'd witnessed during his years at Rosewood, other wagers Fairmont had participated in, other atrocities he'd been forced to witness or participate in. Samuel had also included a letter explaining why he'd hidden these documents here rather than sending them to the courthouse with the other sealed materials. "I trust the law only so far," Samuel had written. "I trust that the documents in the courthouse will survive because powerful people know they exist and will guard them until the appointed time, if only to prevent them from being opened early." But this ledger, this complete record of the club's sins, there are people who would destroy this if they knew where it was. So I hide it in the last place they would look, in the ruins of the chapel where the conspiracy began. And I trust that someday, when the time is right, someone will find it. The discovery created immediate sensation. The Natchez newspapers ran front-page stories. Within days, national papers picked it up. Historians descended on Natchez, demanding access to the ledger, to the survey team's findings, to everything. The archives director, a man named James Thornton who'd held the position since 1946, made a decision that was controversial, but, in retrospect, wise. He had the ledger and Samuel's papers sealed immediately and added to the collection waiting for 1975. But before sealing them, he authorized a complete photographic reproduction of the entire ledger, with one copy to be made immediately available to researchers and another to be added to the sealed archive. The original must be preserved with the other documents, Thornton announced at a press conference. They belong together, part of the same story. But the information in this ledger is too important to keep hidden for another 26 years. We will make it available to scholars immediately, while preserving the originals for the complete revelation in 1975. The decision triggered a firestorm. Descendants of the families named in the ledger, some of whom still held prominent positions in Mississippi, threatened lawsuits, claimed defamation, demanded the ledger be suppressed. Several prominent politicians called for Thornton's dismissal. The state legislature held hearings about whether the archives had the authority to release the photocopies, but Thornton had allies too. Civil rights organizations, Negro newspapers, progressive historians, and younger Southerners, tired of lost cause mythology, supported his decision. The controversy itself generated national attention, bringing scrutiny to Mississippi that many white political leaders would have preferred to avoid. In the end, the photocopies were released in November 1949, exactly 91 years after the Chapel conspiracy. The ledger's contents shocked even people who thought they understood slavery's brutalities. Here was documentary proof, in the perpetrator's own handwriting, of systematic cruelty treated as entertainment. Wages on how long people could survive torture, on whether families could be broken without resistance, on rape, on murder, on every imaginable atrocity, all recorded with casual precision. One entry from 1852 described a wager on whether an enslaved woman could be forced to kill her own child to save her husband from being sold. The outcome noted in neat script: subject refused. Both husband and child sold separately. Subject attempted suicide but was prevented. Amount collected, $500. Another from 1859 documented a wager on whether 4 men could be forced to violate their master's daughter. The entry described it in euphemistic language, but the participants were named Augustus Fairmont and Cornelius Draper, witnessed by William Keene and James Sutherland. The outcome was noted simply: terms disputed, matter settled privately, no amount collected. That single entry, bloodless, clinical, hiding horror beneath bureaucratic language, confirmed everything that had been whispered about for 90 years. And it was one of 237 such entries, each documenting a human wager, each naming names, each providing dates and amounts and outcomes. The release of the ledger photocopies in 1949 fundamentally changed Mississippi's historical landscape. It provided undeniable evidence of systematic cruelty, documented by perpetrators who saw nothing wrong with what they were doing. It made it impossible to maintain romantic myths about benevolent slavery or genteel plantation life. And it demonstrated that resistance, the kind Elizabeth and the 4 men had engaged in, wasn't unusual but necessary, a constant feature of an inherently brutal system. The ledger also revealed something else. The Magnolia Club wasn't unique. The entries referenced similar clubs in Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia, suggesting a network of such organizations across the South. Some historians began tracing these connections, finding evidence of other betting societies, other ledgers that had been destroyed or hidden. other systematic cruelties that had been carefully documented by their perpetrators. Dorothy Keene, the historian who discovered the ledger, spent the next 6 years researching and writing what would become the definitive account of the Magnolia Club. Her book, The Ledger of Atrocity, Human Wages in the Antebellum South, was published in 1955 to widespread acclaim and fierce controversy. Keene dedicated it to Elizabeth Bowling, Samuel Garrison, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac, who conspired together against evil and left testimony that no amount of power could silence forever. The book sold over 100,000 copies in its first year, remarkable for an academic history. It was praised by some reviewers as groundbreaking, condemned by others as anti-Southern propaganda. It received death threats. It also received letters from dozens of descendants, both black and white, sharing family stories that corroborated and expanded on the ledger's entries. But Keene's most important contribution might have been her final chapter, where she analyzed the chapel conspiracy itself. Drawing on the sealed documents she couldn't yet access, but using the ledger entry, Samuel's hidden testimony, Elizabeth's published journals, and other sources, Keene reconstructed what had happened that night and argued for its significance. The conspiracy in Rosewood Chapel, Keene wrote, represents something more profound than individual acts of resistance. It demonstrates that even in the most oppressive systems, even when power seems absolute, human beings find ways to see each other's humanity, to trust across impossible divides, to conspire towards survival. Elizabeth Bowling and the 4 men, Samuel, Joshua, Marcus, and Isaac, came from opposite sides of the most brutal division in American society. Every structure, every law, every social norm told them they were different species, that one group could own the other, that no common ground was possible. And yet, when faced with a situation designed to dehumanize all of them, they chose trust over despair, cooperation over submission, testimony over silence. That choice, replicated thousands of times by thousands of people throughout slavery's long nightmare, is how the system was ultimately defeated, not by armies alone, but by the persistent, dangerous daily decision to recognize shared humanity despite everything. Keene's analysis influenced a generation of historians and civil rights activists. The chapel conspiracy became a teaching example, a story told in churches and meeting halls, a reminder that resistance was always possible, even in the darkest circumstances. By the mid-1950s, the story of the Magnolia Club and the chapel conspiracy had become part of national consciousness in ways that would have been impossible even a decade earlier. The civil rights movement was gaining strength, and stories like these, documented, verified, impossible to dismiss, provided historical weight to contemporary struggles. They demonstrated that the injustices of the present had deep roots, but also that resistance had equally deep roots. As the years passed toward 1975, anticipation grew for the unsealing of the complete archive. Historians knew that significant materials remained sealed. Elizabeth's most detailed journals, complete testimonies from all 4 men, Constance's confession, Crawford's manuscript, Chen's research, and numerous other documents added over the decades. The ledger, discovered in 1949, had been explosive. Everyone wondered what else remained hidden. But fate had other plans. In 1968, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History building was severely damaged in a fire that started in an adjacent structure. The sealed documents survived. They were in a fireproof vault, but the near disaster prompted a reassessment of how they were being preserved. The decision was made to photograph everything, create duplicate copies, and distribute them to multiple institutions to ensure no single disaster could destroy the historical record. During this process, archivists made a startling discovery. Inside one of the sealed boxes, the one containing Elizabeth's later journals, was a letter addressed to whoever reads this in 1975. The letter was dated 1898. 1 year before Elizabeth's death, and represented her final testimony. The archivists debated whether to read the letter. It was technically part of the sealed archive. but ultimately decided that cataloging it for preservation purposes required understanding its contents. What they read left them shaken. In the letter, Elizabeth explained that she'd spent the last 40 years of her life doing something no one had suspected. Using the settlement money from the 1875 case, using donations from sympathetic Northerners, using every resource she could access. She'd been systematically purchasing the freedom of people who'd been wagered by the Magnolia Club. Not the enslaved people themselves, they'd been freed by the war, but their descendants who'd been left landless and destitute. Elizabeth had bought land in Ohio, Illinois, and Kansas. She'd transferred titles to families descended from people named in the ledger. She'd paid for educations, funded businesses, provided startup capital for farms. She'd done all of this anonymously through lawyers and intermediaries because she knew that if her identity was known, the gifts would be rejected or the recipients would be endangered. "I couldn't undo what was done," Elizabeth wrote in her 1898 letter. "I couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't erase the trauma, couldn't restore the years stolen. But I could do something. I could take the money that came from my silence, the settlement that was paid to keep the truth partially hidden, and use it to help build futures for people whose pasts had been destroyed. I have used every penny of my portion of the settlement for this purpose. Not from guilt, though I have plenty of that. Not from pity, which would be an insult. But from recognition that my survival and theirs were intertwined, that the conspiracy we began in that chapel in 1858 didn't end that night. It continued for 40 years, transformed from a desperate act of survival into a deliberate campaign to redistribute stolen wealth back to those it was stolen from." Elizabeth's letter included detailed records of every purchase, every land transfer, every scholarship funded. She'd helped 147 families over 4 decades, spending nearly $80,000, an enormous sum representing essentially all the money she'd received from the settlement. She'd lived simply in her cottage, teaching in her small school, devoting everything else to this secret redistribution. "When you read this in 1975, Elizabeth concluded her letter, you will likely see me as a figure from ancient history, my world and its concerns as remote as the Roman Empire. But I hope you will understand that the questions we faced, how to resist oppression, how to see each other's humanity across artificial divisions, how to make amends for wrongs that cannot be undone, how to build justice from the ruins of injustice. These questions do not age. They are your questions too, in different forms perhaps, but fundamentally the same. I don't know what world you live in. I hope it's better than mine. But if it isn't, if you still struggle with inequality and cruelty and systems that treat some people as less than human, then remember what we did in that chapel. We trusted each other when trust seemed impossible. We conspired together when conspiracy meant risking everything. We testified to truth even when silence would have been safer. And we survived. That's all I can offer you across these decades, the knowledge that resistance is possible, that change is possible, that humanity persists even in the most inhuman circumstances. Use that knowledge however you need to. And when your own dark night comes, and it will come in one form or another, remember that you are not the first to face it, and others before you found ways to survive, and even, sometimes, to win. The archivists who read this letter in 1968 were moved enough to petition for early release of the complete archive. They argued that 7 more years of sealing served no purpose, that the material was too important to keep hidden, that the fire damage provided justification for reassessing the original terms. The petition was denied. The seals would hold until 1975 as stipulated. But knowledge of Elizabeth's letter leaked. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, as America wrestled with civil rights, Vietnam, and fundamental questions about justice and national identity, the story of the Chapel conspiracy took on new resonance. Young activists, both black and white, saw in Elizabeth and the four men a model for interracial cooperation, for resistance against impossible odds, for using whatever resources you had to work toward justice. The fact that Elizabeth had spent 40 years redistributing wealth to descendants of the Magnolia Club's victims resonated powerfully in debates about reparations and economic justice. Scholars planning